Hello, class, and welcome to Chapter 15, Power. We can't really understand the diverse expressions of power if we focus exclusively on the formal political institutions of a state. Cooperation, conflict, and power are rooted in people's everyday social interactions, belief systems, as well as cultural practices. But let's go ahead and define politics. That's those relationships and processes of cooperation, conflict, and power that are fundamental aspects of human life. So the question is, does every society have a government? Well, it's kind of a tricky question. Some societies have centralized political authority in the form of a government, which would be defined as a separate legal and constitutional domain that is a source of law, order, and legitimate force, while others historically, and this is what we've done for more of human history than not, have lived in an acephalous society, or you could say egalitarian society. And these are societies without a governing head, generally with no hierarchical leadership. So, informal leadership. This is the acephalous society or egalitarian society, and they typically have informal leaders. We typically call them big men or just the elders of the society. So these are people who tend to come into their quote unquote power through things such as being a good hunter or an orator or knowing the history really well, being able to resolve conflicts, that kind of stuff. So it's kind of interesting when you think about it. Some cultures and the oh my goodness, the Kong, of Africa have it so that even women are allowed to have female leadership roles. This photo is of a quote unquote big man from Malaysia who happens to be female. So, nasty, brutish, and short. This is what we're kind of talking about as far as when we look at colonialism. So the Age of Enlightenment was from 1650 to 1800. During these times, we were getting away from religion and more towards a scientific understanding of the world around us. English philosopher Thomas Hobbes said life without formal political control is nasty, brutish, and short. And he was trying to make this point that humans needed some sort of centralized government, and that to not have that central controlling government, we would just go crazy and be savage. Remember, this was also the time of colonialization, so the need to other those that were not of European descent was very big on their minds. In order to be able to do the things that they did to the local populations, they had to see them as being less than. John Locke also said that it was a necessity of a social contract and rules of law. Again, very much trying to establish this othering of the egalitarian type societies and reinforce their dominance over the colonized areas. That does bring us to politics and colonialism. So when we're talking about this, the colonial governance permitted studies of the maintenance of order in societies without formal governments and political leaders. These were done as a way of trying to help control the population. One of the negative consequences of these studies was the assumption that similar forms of government should be forced on non-European people through colonialism. These colonial structures did produce what we call structural functionalism, and we kind of talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the semester, where it's British structural functionalism, and Sir Evans Pritchard is the one who made this really famous, and his example of the noir. But this, I'll just go over it very, very quickly, is a theory that different structures or institutions of a society, such as religion, politics, kinship, etc., function to maintain social order as well as equilibrium. It also looks at the fact that you need to look at each of these different cultural institutions in isolation and very detailed in order to understand a culture, and you bring those understandings of the different cultural institutions together to understand the whole of the community. So, social controls. Many pastoralist or egalitarian type societies divide men, and of course some women as well, from different families into what we call age grades. And this is the groupings of age mates who are initiated into adulthood together. So it might be a group of boys who are ages, say, 12 to 16, just so that they have a group together. And we will talk about Victor Turner and liminality and all that, and that will kind of explain this need to have a grouping of people to go through these transitional times together. They also noticed that religious rituals can reinforce political power, maintain solidarity within a group, and unity against other groups, and resolve local disputes. And we'll, again, talk about this a little bit more when we talk about religion and Emile Durkheim and his idea of collective effervescence. But a very good example of how these religious rituals can reinforce this is that through sub-Saharan Africa, people who do not adhere to cultural norms are liable to be accused of witchcraft or sorcery and therefore punished. Structural functionalists argue that the belief in witchcraft operates as a rudimentary criminal justice system without any formal laws. Kind of cool. Okay, so your book really does separate how people distribute power into two separate categories, non-centralized and centralized. The non-centralized are political systems in which power and control over resources are dispersed between members of the societies. These are more of the egalitarian type societies. And we have two types. We have bands and tribes. Bands are small, nomadic, self-sufficient groups of anywhere between 20 and 150 individuals with face-to-face social relations, usually very egalitarian in nature. And then we have the tribe. This is a type of pastoralist or horticulturalist society, and they typically have populations numbering in the hundreds or thousands, in which leadership is more stabilized than that of a band, but it is usually egalitarian with social relationships based on reciprocal exchange. So that brings us to the centralized power distribution. This is when there are political systems in which certain individuals and institutions hold power and control over all of the resources. And there are two types, chiefdoms and states. So a chiefdom is a political system with a hierarchical leader who holds central authority, typically supported by a class of high-ranking elites, informal laws, and simple judicial systems, but offering up the number of people in this kind of society is in the tens of thousands. This is this kind of interesting time in the historical lives of people, as it is when we start to see intensive agriculture as well as some specialization starting to happen. It's also seen as a stepping stone to the last of services typology, which is the state. And this is a more complex form of political organization associated with societies that have intense agriculture, high levels of social stratification, as well as centralized authority. So what exactly is political power? We can define political power as the process by which people create, complete, and use power to attain goals that are presumed to be for the good of the community. Deities, ancestors, heredity transfer, legal inheritance, elected officials, and so on and so forth. In the 1960s, there was an emphasis shift from ordering societies to exploring how individuals acquired the access and used power within the society. Legitimate political power must be based on culturally recognized sources, but it can also be drawn from material, human, symbolic, or ideological resources. So, action theory follows the daily activity and decision-making processes of individual political leaders. It also emphasizes that politics is dynamic and competitive field of social relations in which people are constantly managing their ability to exercise power over one another. Normative roles and pragmatic roles. These are things that help to instill the sense of power and allow others to use these systems of politics. Structural power. So by the 1980s and 90s, cultural anthropologists recognized that additional need to investigate power structures. Power that not only operates within settings, but also organizes and orchestrates the settings in which social and individual actions take place. David Horn in 1994 used the concept of structural power to trace a rise in Italian acceptance of state intervention in healthcare decisions, which is kind of cool. Your book does talk about it a little bit more. Anyway, this is the end of part 1. I will see you in a little bit for part 2. Cheers.